Well, welcome back. Good to see you. So glad you're with me. Today we're going to talk about building your team. I hope as we go through these sessions, you're taking notes, going back through the sessions and looking at some of the other leaders I've referenced. Leaders like John Maxwell and Rick Warren, Bill Hybels, Andy Stanley, so many others. They've all got a plethora of books, articles, podcasts that you should just dive into. In essence, look to make these great leaders part of your team. Not the team you lead, of course, but the team that is part of building your leadership. Because as important as it is, to have a great team to lead and to lead them well, it's equally important to have a team that you look to lead you well. We'll talk more about that in sessions 9 and 10 when we go over seeking wisdom and caring for yourself and your family. But now let's talk about building the team that you'll lead. As you can see, I'm here at the Little League ball fields that are right around the corner from our house. I've played and watched and coached baseball throughout my entire life. Now, I know for some, baseball is a little too slow of a game. But if you're a fan, you know how much teamwork is involved, how much strategy, perhaps more than any other sport. Strategy, timing, and everyone being in the right place at the right time is critical. And that's the way it is with your team. That's the way it is with your team if it's going to run well. Now, often we get handed a team. They're already in place. We may have had no role in selecting who they are or what positions they'll play. In this case, when this is the case, you'll come to learn about your team, yes, as you watch them perform, but more so as you apply the principles we've talked about in the relationship and transparency sessions. Go back and review those if you need to. But if you have the opportunity to build your team, or add to it as the need for growth or replacement presents itself, you'll be making decisions that will either carry the mission forward by leaps and bounds or could potentially suck the life out of you as you deal with people that you've chosen that aren't committed to the vision or aren't playing the right position on the team. But let's see what Paul has to say about this idea of selecting your teammates. In 1 Timothy 5:22, Paul is again giving Timothy instruction on leading the Ephesian church. He says, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands. See, the leaders in the church, the elders, would lay hands on someone and pray over them as they ordained them or commissioned them for a task or to take on a role. So what Paul is saying here is, don't be too quick to pick someone and give them responsibility. Another example of this type of discernment is shown to us by Jesus himself. In the book of Luke, chapter 6, verses 12 and 13, we find the process Jesus went through to choose his 12 apostles, his team. And he chose these from all the disciples that were following him at the time. And here's what it says. On one of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. See, he spent the entire night praying about which 12 to select. It was that important. One of the roles I filled at my previous church was the groups pastor at one of our campuses. It was a multi-campus church, and I was the groups pastor at one of our campuses. From the time I was initially asked if I was interested to the time I was chosen to take on the role was probably 4 or 5 months, maybe even a little longer. And I knew there were other people being looked at, and there was a process involved, of course. But I have to admit, I didn't expect 5 months of periodic lunch meetings with groups and campus pastors, interspersed with what seemed to be long periods of inactivity. I was okay with whichever way they went. I trusted my leadership's judgment, and I trusted God. But there were times I thought, boy, let's get on with this, Fact is, they were simply taking Paul's very wise counsel. Don't be hasty in the laying on of hands. In the end, in my humble opinion, they made a wise choice. So, we've just talked about taking time, being thoughtful, praying about choosing your team. But what is it you're looking for in potential members? Well, we covered some of that in session 2, 1 Timothy 3, when we looked at the attributes of a leader. Remember that? Well, many of those are the same attributes you're looking for when selecting team members. But look also at chapter 5, verse 24. It gives us some great wisdom on assessing those we'll select to serve with us. It says this: "The sins of some men are obvious, reaching the place of judgment ahead of them. The sins of others trail behind them." So in other words, for some, their reputation will precede them. You'll know through stories, references, and perhaps your own observations what issues or shortcomings this person may have, what gifts they bring. In those cases, you should be able to assess all that you need to do to make the right decision for your organization. But sometimes those flaws are not as apparent. Sometimes it'll require additional work. What does that mean? In baseball or any sport, it may mean physical exams as well as interviews to determine character and whether or not they'll be a good fit for your team. For us, it means background or reference checks, connecting with those that have worked with this person in the past, those that know him or her best, wherever is possible. It means a meaningful interview process. Notice I said process, not just a meaningful interview. That process should include, where possible, sessions with those this person will work with, those they'll lead if it's a leadership position, the person they'll report directly to, and that may be you. It should include your boss if they want to be part of that process or if it's appropriate. You should meet with them at least 2 or 3 times if it's a leadership or key position. And those meetings should be in 2 or 3 different locations. Don't make them all in an office setting with you behind the desk and them on the other side in a shorter chair, Make one in a casual setting, couches or comfy chairs, more like a living room. Maybe hang out at a local park, like this. Make one over a meal. People become relaxed and conversational whenever there's food involved. And don't make it a high-end, stuffy restaurant where you need to worry about which fork to use, for which part of the meal. Keep it casual. You need to get a really good sense of who they are, not just what they know or what they can do. And this type of process can really help you do that. I read recently where one CEO takes his prospective new team member that he's interviewing out to eat, and he arranges in advance for something to be wrong with their order. Then he simply observes how they handle it. Are they rude or intolerant? Do they show grace? Do they do nothing at all? It's an interesting approach. I might employ that next time I've got a team member I've got to bring on board. Be fun too. Lastly, and most importantly, follow the example Jesus set for us in Luke 6. Pray. Spend some time in solitude, just allowing him to speak to you, to give you a sense of whether this person is a yes or a no. The wrong decision, at a minimum, will suck up your time and distract you from the real mission. And at worst, a wrong decision can suck the life out of you and derail your team and its goals. The right decision could bring new ideas, a fresh perspective, renewed energy, and lighten the load for you and the rest of your team. There may be no more important decision you'll make in leadership than the ones that involve selecting and building your team and ensuring that the players you have are playing the right position. An all-star shortstop is going to quickly become a burden or a liability to the team if he finds himself being asked to play catcher. Let me share a quick story about who needs to be on the team, or in some cases, who may need help finding a different team. When I was leading an operation for a large financial services firm some years back, I had a guy working for me. We'll call him Sherman. Sherman handled most of the reporting for the operation. It was a very technical role. He designed and ran reports that helped us measure how we were doing against our goals. It was a very specialized skill that very few had, and he knew that. He had done some digging and found that folks in similar jobs in his native Connecticut were making significantly more money than he was. Well, one of the big issues was we weren't in Connecticut. We were in Knoxville, Tennessee. And we did our very best to pay him pretty well for the role he was in. He came in a number of times and shared his frustration with me. I had already done all I could do to elevate the level of the job, which resulted in higher pay grade and more money for him. But it wasn't going to be able to get him to where he wanted to be, which was to see a paycheck that looked like the ones his peers in Connecticut were getting. Our last conversation about this topic went something like this. Sherman, I said, I think a lot of you. I know, and I know you know, that I've done all I can to get you what I can. But I think you're at a point where you're just not happy here, and I hate to see you unhappy. I'd hate to lose you, but sometimes we have to make a move in order to feel good about where we're at. Well, that wasn't what Sherman wanted to hear, but it was what he needed to hear. It wasn't contentious, it wasn't an ugly conversation, it was just a candid conversation I needed to have with him as his leader and someone who cared about him. Well, Sherman ultimately did move on. He secured a job back in his native Connecticut with a new team, making more money, and him and his family flourished. And by all accounts, life has been very good to him since. Now, it was probably 3 or 4 years after I had left the organization that one of the managers that had worked for me at the time, with whom I had stayed connected through Facebook, let me know that he had been in touch with Sherman. He mentioned to Sherman that he and I, this manager and I, were still connected. Well, Sherman recounted that last discussion to my manager friend and told him how at the time he was so very disappointed. Then he went on to say how he now realizes it was the best thing that ever happened to him. He talked about how grateful he was to me for being candid with him and giving him the incentive, the nudge he needed to make the change. He asked my manager friend to share that with me and to pass that on to me. I was so thankful to hear that after all that time had passed, to see that he had recognized the value in our conversation and that it resulted in a positive life change for him. Sometimes what we might view as a negative or difficult conversation can have the most significant positive impact on someone's life. So here's our takeaways. First, don't be too quick to bring people in. Be patient. Leave a role unoccupied if you're not sure you have the right person to fill it right now. Second, understand all you can about those you consider. Remember, the shortcomings of some will be evident, but for others, you may have to put in significant time and energy into knowing who they are, if they're going to fit the role that you're looking to fill. And remember to create a really robust interview process. Next, review the attributes for leaders in 1 Timothy chapter 3. There's every reason to apply this same test of characteristics to potential candidates for any position on the team. 4, pray about it. Follow your gut, follow your heart, and follow God's nudgings and leadings, and you'll make the right decision. Lastly, don't be hesitant to have that conversation with a person who needs to consider a move to a different position or maybe a different team. You owe it to your team and to the person who needs to make that move. Next time, we're going to go wide. We're going to talk about vision, focus, and commitment. As a leader, even of a small team, maybe even of one, you're looked to cast vision and keep others focused on that vision. This can be a little harder to get your hands around, but it's one of the key differences between someone who is a manager only and someone who truly leads as they manage. Thanks so much for being with me. Thanks so much for spending time with me. Praying for you and your team. Hope your team, whoever you follow, does well this season. See you next week.